Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're doing something of a philosophical excavation, digging deep into one of the thorniest logical puzzles from ancient Greek thought.
Yeah, and it's a big one.
It really is. We're looking at Aristotle's definition of justice in the Nicomachean Ethics, specifically Book V.
A book that has, let's just say it's caused centuries of headaches for commentators.
Right. And the puzzle itself is actually older than Aristotle. I mean, you see Socrates, the sophists, all wrestling with it. It really boils down to this fundamental question about moral character. Is justice just one specific trait, a part of virtue like courage or moderation? Or is justice the exact same thing as complete virtue?
Is it a virtue or is it all of virtue?
Exactly.
And this wasn't just, an abstract debate for them. Socrates was very clear on this. He warned that if you can't definitively say whether justice is a part or the whole, you don't actually know what justice is. Or virtue, for that matter.
So the stakes are incredibly high.
Immense. And you had thinkers like Meno and Protagoras generally landing on the side of it being just a part, kind of limiting its scope.
But then Aristotle comes along. He takes up this debate, and instead of giving a clear answer, he seems to give us, answers that fly in the face of one another.
They seem to deliberately contradict.
Yeah, he'll give us identity in one sentence, then a distinction in the next, and then some kind of limitation in the third. And this conflict, it's not just a textual quirk.
Oh, not at all.
It changes everything about how we understand things like political leadership or even how to cultivate a good character.
Absolutely. It dictates, for instance, whether a truly just ruler, and by that we mean a person whose actions are perfect pros heteron, so toward others, is that person automatically a fully flourishing human being?
A huge question.
It is, and it also determines how we should structure ethical training, and maybe most importantly, it gets to the heart of whether being just is actually good for you, the agent, or if it's only good for the people you happen to be governing.
So our mission today is to try and resolve this apparent logical inconsistency. We want to unlock what we think is Aristotle's true, subtle, and ultimately unified theory of general justice.
And to do that, we need a very specific interpretive tool.
A very specialized one, but an absolutely essential one. It's the distinction between what a virtuous person is and what a virtuous person does.
That is the key. You have to distinguish between the philosophical state and the exercise.
Okay, let's get the Greek terms on the table.
So first you have hexis, that's X. This is the state. We're going to call it justices or virtuous for shorthand. It's the underlying disposition, the settled potential, the character condition that resides in your soul.
So it's like owning a skill. It's the potential you have.
Exactly. Think of it as having a black belt in karate. You possess that state, that hexis.
And then the other side of the coin is krisis, that's tresis. And this is the exercise. We'll call it justice or virtue.
Right. This is the activity, the performance, the actual moment you apply that skill.
So it's the difference between having the black belt and actually using it in a fight.
Perfect. And here's the crucial point. If you, the listener, confuse the definition of the hexis with the definition of the krisis, if you try to apply the rules of the action to the character state, the whole of Book V just collapses. It becomes a massive, unsolvable, logical contradiction.
But our argument today is that Aristotle is perfectly coherent.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
But only if we respect this distinction at every single step of the argument.
Okay, so before we apply the tool, let's lay out the crime scene. Let's show just how messy this philosophical landscape looks without it. What are the major modern interpretations and why is there so much disagreement?
The disagreement runs very, very deep.
Yeah.
You can basically see three primary philosophical camps that have tried to make sense of Aristotle's conflicting statements.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is what we can call the justice is a part camp. This is an interpretation you'll see from commentators like Cursor, and they argue that general justice is only the other regarding slice of virtue.
The other regarding slice. So what does that mean in practice?
It means it's not really a unified character state on its own. It's more of a composite, or what some call a second-order virtue.
So if I'm courageous, that's a virtue. But justice, in this view, is just the part of my courage I use when I'm, say, defending the city wall.
Mm-hmm.
Because that action is pros heteron in relation to another.
Precisely. It's as if you isolate the social application of every single other virtue, bundle them all together, and just slap the label justice on that collection.
So it's about behavior, not about an internal disposition.
Yes, it's a collection of performances. Now, the second major camp is the complete opposite. This is the justice is identical view.
Okay.
Thinkers in this camp, like Kraut, for example, argue really strongly against that composite idea. They insist that general justice and virtue are fundamentally the same thing. They are numerically one and the same character state.
So for them, general justice is just virtue, full
Right.
stop. Maybe just viewed through a political lens or something.
Exactly. They prioritize all the texts where Aristotle speaks about their unity.
And what's the third camp?
The third offers a kind of subtle compromise. It's the justice is coextensive view.
Coextensive.
Yeah, proponents here argue that general justice and virtue are not identical states, but they are necessarily possessed together. So if you have justice, you must have all the virtues, and if you have all the virtues, you must have justice.
Ah, so they always show up together, but they aren't the same thing.
Right. They belong to the same group of people, the same extension of agents. But it's a weaker claim than identity because it suggests you actually have two distinct character states that just, happen to be inseparable.
It's like saying every creature with a heart is a creature with a kidney. They are coextensive in that group, but the definition of heart and the definition of kidney are totally different.
That's a perfect analogy. And this whole disagreement exists because, as you said, Aristotle gives us what looks like conflicting data. So let's lay out the three specific textual claims that have caused all this chaos.
Let's do it. The evidence for the prosecution.
First, we have what we'll call the part claim. Aristotle states, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, justice is complete virtue, not without qualification, but complete virtue in relation to another. Or pros heteron.
Okay, so the moment he adds that restriction in relation to another, it feels like a limitation.
It has to be. If it's complete virtue only in a specific context, it logically suggests it must be a specific part of virtue because virtue itself must exist beyond that one context.
That seems pretty straightforward. I mean, my entire moral character virtue includes how I treat myself when I'm all alone, but justice is only about how I treat others. So justice has to be a smaller part of the whole thing.
Seems unavoidable, right? But then, just a bit later, Aristotle hits us with the whole claim.
And this,
He says, justice is not a part of virtue, but virtue as a whole.
wow. Okay, so that's about as direct a contradiction as you can get.
It seems to be a clear, unambiguous statement supporting the identity camp. Complete numerical sameness. It appears to just flat out invalidate the first claim we just discussed.
And there's a third one, the most metaphysically tricky one.
Yes, the sameness claim. This is where he says, justice and virtue are the same, but the being is not the same. And this introduces that Greek phrase, to da inai outate. The being, or the essence, is not the same.
So, how can two things be the same thing if their very essence is different? This is where that coextensive camp gets its leverage, I imagine.
Precisely. And the reason this is a complete logical catastrophe for anyone who doesn't distinguish between the state and the exercise is because of Aristotle's own logical framework that he lays out in Book 5.
The parthood principle.
The parthood principle.
We really need to unpack this because this feels like the acid test for any theory trying to solve this.
It is. The parthood principle is an uncompromising piece of, well, you could call it set theory. It says, if every case of X is a case of Y, but not every case of Y is a case of X, then X is a proper part of Y.
So if the relationship is asymmetrical, you've got a par-hole structure. My cat example from before.
Exactly. Now, let's apply this to virtue and justice without our special tool, without distinguishing state and exercise.
Okay, let's see the paradox form.
If we accept claim 1 that justice is only virtue pros heteron, so directed toward another, then it follows that every action of justice is also an action of virtue.
Right. That's the first half of the principle satisfied. Every X is a Y.
But, as you pointed out, virtue also includes actions that are purely self-regarding. Resisting the urge to eat a whole cake, acting with self-moderation. These don't require another person.
So not every action of virtue is an action of justice. Not every Y is an X.
Correct. So if we just treat justice and virtue as these blob-like unified concepts without separating internal character from external performance, the conclusion is logically forced upon us.
By Aristotle's own rule.
By his own parthood principle, justice must be a part of virtue. And that result crashes directly into claim 2, where he explicitly says justice is not a part of virtue, but virtue as a whole.
This is the knot. The text gives us the rules of logic, and then it gives us two claims that seem to break those very rules.
Unless we've misunderstood the subject. The contradiction is mathematically precise. And the only lever strong enough to pry it apart is the distinction between the hexis and the crisis.
Okay, let's finally bring in our tool and start untying this knot. We have to start with the internal disposition, the character state, the hexis. Let's call it justices.
Right.
And we need to defend the most ambitious claim, which is that justices is numerically identical to virtuous. So we're looking at that whole claim.
Exactly. Aristotle's assertion that justice is virtue as a whole has to refer specifically to the underlying state, to justices. Now, we think that because the whole discussion comes right after he's been describing the excellent person.
Ah, the bearer of the disposition.
Yes, he's talking about their capacity to act virtuously toward others. He's defining the character of the individual, not just the quality of their actions in the moment.
That context clue immediately focuses us on the internal configuration of the soul. And if we accept that, we have to adopt what you call the sameness reading.
We do. Justices and virtuous are numerically one and the same disposition.
You had an analogy for this, the road.
The road, yes. Think about the road from Thebes to Athens and the road from Athens to Thebes. It is one and the same physical road. You don't have two distinct roads paved next to each other.
Right.
You have one single entity that we refer to with two different names, and the name just depends on your direction of travel, on your perspective. Justices and virtues are that single, unified road of character.
So this immediately dismisses that third camp, the merely coextensive reading.
It has to.
Because if they were merely coextensive, it would be like having two separate states that just happen to always reside in the same person. Two separate roads that always run parallel.
And that would make Aristotle's language about their unity feel really philosophically weak. The sameness reading insists on a unified potentiality. It also, of course, rejects the part reading for the state. There's no separate section of your character that is justices. Justice is the entire character state of virtues.
Okay, hang on. If you're saying justices and virtuous are identical, doesn't that make Aristotle incredibly redundant? I mean, he spends a whole book, Book 5, on justice.
Right.
If it's just virtue repackaged, why spend all that time on it after he's already spent Book 2 defining virtue?
That's a great challenge. It's a really powerful one, and it's one that any identity reading has to answer. But our interpretation actually explains this very oddity, this noticeable brevity in Aristotle's discussion of general justice.
Brevity, the whole book.
But think about what's missing. Compared to the rich detail he gives for virtues like courage or temperance, his discussion of general justice is quite sparse.
So why the sparseness?
Because justices is identical to virtues, there's no need for him to spend time defining a unique mean for general justice or detailing a unique motivational profile. General justice just shares the exact same explanatory features, the mean, the desire structure, how you acquire it, that were already exhaustively laid out for virtue as a whole in the earlier books.
So, the role of general justice in Book 5 isn't to define a new ethical quality at all. It's just to define the scope of the existing quality when it enters the political arena.
Precisely. He's using a principle of explanatory economy, what we'll call the non-proliferation principle later. Since justices does no new explanatory work that virtuous hasn't already done, he doesn't need to posit a whole new state. He just establishes the identity, asserts its prose heteron dimension, and then moves on to the specific types of justice, like particular justice, which do need their own unique definitions.
That's actually a very elegant defense. It just assumes the reader is diligent and is carrying the knowledge from Book 2 forward into Book 5.
It does assume a diligent reader, yes. But now we have to face the contradiction again. If the state is unified and whole, how can Aristotle logically claim that justice is only virtue prose heteron and thereby meet the criteria to be a park?
Right. This is where we have to shift our lens completely from the hexis to the crisis, from the state to the exercise.
We have to acknowledge a pivot in Aristotle's text. When he says that justice is virtue in relation to another, the whole focus has shifted to lawfulness. And lawfulness is inherently based on public actions, on exercises.
Okay, let's look at that crucial part claim again. Justice is complete virtue, not without qualification, but in relation to another. So you're saying this must refer to the performance, the exercise, justice-y.
It has to. And justice must be limited to this other regarding sphere because it's intrinsically linked to the law. And what does the law regulate?
Actions where another person is involved.
Always. Theft, murder, adultery, failing to stand your ground in battle. These are all prose heteron actions.
The law is about the public and the communal. It can't really regulate my purely internal or self-regarding acts, my decision to eat an entire cake in private while, maybe immoderate. It's not an act of injustice against society.
Precisely. No law governs your private tea consumption habits unless they somehow directly harm a third party or the state. Therefore, the exercise of justice, justice C, only happens when another person is involved.
And this is where the whole contradiction just dissolves, because the parthood principle comes back, but now we're applying it to the right category. We're applying it to the exercises.
Let's walk through it. Since every single case of justice is always pros heteron, it is by definition a case of virtue.
Okay.
But virtue, the exercise of virtue, includes self-regarding acts, like acts of pure moderation or courage that are not pros heteron. Therefore, not every case of virtue is a case of justice.
And if every case of X is a Y, but not every case of Y is an X,
then X is a proper part of Y.
we have satisfied the parthood principle perfectly.
Perfectly. Justice as a state, justices, is the whole of virtues. And that's why Aristotle can say it is not a part. But justice as an exercise, justice C, is a part of virtue, defined by its necessary restriction to the other regarding realm.
That is a genuinely elegant resolution. So decades, centuries of scholarly disagreement can be reconciled just by applying these definitions to the right philosophical category: potentiality versus actuality.
One unified potentiality, which is the state, that yields two distinct actualizations, which are the exercises. And these two actualizations stand in a whole-part relationship to each other.
And this distinction also hosts with another famous problem, right? The sophistic objection from Thrasymachus.
Yes, that justice is another's good. The idea that being just is basically a form of foolish self-sacrifice.
Thrasymachus was essentially asking, why should I, as a rational person, act justly if all the benefits just go to my neighbor or to the state? What's in it for me?
And the state exercise distinction provides Aristotle's very sophisticated answer. He can actually concede to Thrasymachus that, yes, the exercise, justice E, is indeed entirely directed toward another's good. It is defined by that.
So he agrees with the observation about the act.
He does, but, and this is the crucial part, the cultivation and the possession of the underlying state, justices, which we now know is identical to virtues, that is fundamentally good for the agent.
Because having that internal disposition of complete virtue is what constitutes human flourishing, or eudaimonia.
Absolutely. When the ruler acts justly, when they perform justice, yes, the action benefits the citizens, but the capacity to perform that action is what makes the ruler an excellent, flourishing person. The goodness of justice for the agent is rooted in the perfection of the underlying state, not in the direct outcome of any one specific act.
The ultimate benefit is internal in the character, even if the immediate effect is external.
Exactly. And this unity of the state also reinforces why we have to reject that merely coextensive reading.
How so?
Well, if justices and virtues were two distinct states that just happen to belong to the same person, then justice would be the exercise of the justice state. It would be very strange for Aristotle to call it the exercise of complete virtue. He would just call it the exercise of the coextensive state of justice. The fact that he uses the phrase complete virtue implies the state being exercised is numerically one and the same as the complete character disposition.
Okay, this is all falling into place. We now have the context we need to tackle the deepest metaphysical statement, the one that really separates Aristotle from everyone who came before him.
Claim 3.
Let's revisit that enigmatic phrase. It is the same, but the being is not the same. To to toya deata.
This is Aristotle at his most precise. They are the same single state. That's the to auto part. But the sense, or the definition, the being, the to einai, or the logos, is different.
But wait, if we accept the identity theory, that justice equals virtuous, how can the definition be different? If two things are numerically identical, shouldn't their definitions also be identical?
Not necessarily in Aristotelian metaphysics. The definition, the logos, can change based on how we conceive of the state's potentiality. The underlying disposition, the hexis, is identical, but the definition of that state changes based on the actuality, the krisis it points toward.
So the hexis is the same thing, but the logos, or the definition we assign to it, changes depending on whether we're looking at its potential for other regarding action, which we call justice, or for action in general, which we call virtue.
That's it, exactly. When we define that single state through the lens of its public, political, other regarding actions, we have to call it justice. The definition has to reference the prose heteron dimension. When we define that same single state through the lens of its full scope, including self-regarding acts, we call it virtue. This pushes the difference down to the level of the application of the state, so we don't have to posit two separate things inside a person's soul.
And this leads us to a central idea in Aristotle's thought, doesn't it? The groundbreaking idea that one state, one potentiality, can have two distinct actualities.
Yes. The potentiality, justices S equals virtue S, is one. But the actualizations, justice and virtue, are two.
This is a crucial move. It keeps the agent's soul metaphysically simple while still accounting for the complexity of moral achievement. How does he justify this?
Well, as is so typical for Aristotle, when he wants to solve a problem in ethics, he looks outside of ethics. He looks at biology.
And the sources point us to the anima on the soul, specifically his discussion of the nutritive soul. Can you explain that analogy for us?
Sure. The nutritive soul is the basic life force common to plants and animals. And Aristotle insists it is a single capacity, a single dynamis or potentiality. But, he observes, it has two very distinct demonstrable functions, or erga.
And those are?
The function of using nutrition, so taking in food for sustenance, and the function of reproduction, generating offspring.
Okay, and those are obviously very different functions. You don't perform one every time you perform the other.
Absolutely not. Not every act of eating leads to reproduction, and yet they both flow from the same essential capacity, the capacity for self-maintenance and continuation.
So why does he unify them into one soul capacity? What's the connection?
The connection is the ultimate end, the telos. Both functions are directed toward the same ultimate goal, the preservation of the individual and the continuation of the species. They serve a single, unified purpose of life.
Okay, so let's apply this back to ethics. Justices and virtues are the single capacity, the unified ethical hexes.
Right.
And justice and virtue are the two distinct functions, the two krisis.
And both of these functions are directed toward the same ultimate goal, flourishing through virtuous action. Justice Z is just the specific, restricted realization of that goal, the act of flourishing pros heteron. Virtue is the unqualified, complete realization. The state is one because the goal is one, but the exercises are two because the social context of the performance is demonstrably different.
And this whole structure is justified by that principle you mentioned earlier, the non-proliferation principle, the idea of explanatory economy.
Don't use two states when one will do the work.
Right.
Since justices and virtues as potential states share the same mean, the same mode of acquisition, the same motivational structure, positing a second distinct state of justices does no extra explanatory work. It's just redundant. It violates economy.
So the only reason we even need a conceptual distinction is to differentiate the act. I mean, acting virtuously in private is an important achievement, but acting virtuously toward another, ruling justly, for instance, is considered by Aristotle to be a much harder, more complete achievement.
It is the demonstrably different achievement that forces the distinction, but only at the level of the exercise. The underlying engine, the disposition, is the same. The distinction is only necessary for the logos, the definition, and for understanding the scope of the action in the political and legal world.
We have so far established a really coherent picture for general justice and virtue, but Aristotle isn't done. He introduces a second category, particular justice.
Yes.
This relates to specific goods like honor, wealth, and safety. And this introduces a separate, specific philosophical dilemma that many commentators have seized on.
They have. The dilemma, as articulated by scholars like Brodie and Rowe, basically charges Aristotle with incoherence again. Because particular justice is clearly meant to be a species of virtue, right alongside courage and moderation.
Okay, so if it's a species of virtue, it should behave like the other virtues.
Exactly. This implies that the internal state, particular justices, should behave like other states and be applicable to self-regarding acts.
So if courage is a virtue, I can exercise courage against my own fear. If moderation is a virtue, I can exercise it in controlling my own appetites. So if particular justice is a species of virtue, I should be able to exercise it even if no other person is directly involved.
You should, but the text is explicit when discussing injustice. Particular injustice always has its power, pros, heteron in relation to another. So if we interpret that restriction as applying to the state, to particular justices, then that state is radically different from all the other virtues, and the whole coherent structure breaks down again.
So we have to apply the critical tool one last time. We have to insist that the pros heteron restriction applies only to the action, to the exercise.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We maintain that particular justices, the state, is a proper species or part of general justices, and therefore a virtuous. Since it's a character state, a disposition, it can potentially be exercised in relation to oneself or one's own immediate family.
For example, distributing inherited wealth fairly among one's own children. That's an action concerning wealth and equality, but it might not be strictly pros heteron in the big legalistic sense.
Exactly. But the moment we look at particular justice, see, the exercise, the claim that it has its power in relation to another, refers explicitly to the action's social and political impact.
So the restriction applies to the performance.
Yes. When Aristotle describes general and particular injustice, he uses these parallel structures. The exercise is characterized by its other regarding nature because the specific goods involved, wealth, honor, safety, are inherently things that are subject to external distribution among people in a community.
The coherence is perfectly restored. The state, particular justices, is a normal ethical virtue, a species sharing characteristics with other virtues. But its full definitional exercise, particular justice, is necessarily restricted to the prose heteron dimension because of the nature of the goods it manages.
And this gives us a wonderfully stable and coherent structure for the entire ethical hierarchy, all organized by that parthood principle.
Let's detail that final structure then, starting with the exercises.
Okay, at the level of exercises, the actions, we have a clear part-whole relationship. Particular justice is a proper part of general justice, and general justice is a proper part of virtue. Every just action concerning wealth is a generally just action, but not every generally just action is about wealth.
Right, and every generally just action is a virtuous action, but not every virtuous action is generally just, since some are purely self-regarding.
The hierarchy is perfect.
And now, the relationship among the internal states.
At the level of states, the dispositions, we have a species-whole relationship. Particular justices is a species of general justices, which is numerically identical to virtues.
So particular justices is just one species of the whole disposition, sitting right alongside other virtues like courage S and moderation S.
Exactly. The internal reality is unified, while the external expression is structured by social necessity.
This level of detail, this precision in distinguishing potentiality and actuality, it really shows the power of Aristotle's thinking. If we stop there, the logical knot is untied. But let's pivot now to the bigger picture. What are the implications for living an excellent life that flow from this identity of the state? Justices equals virtue S.
The unity of the internal state has enormous practical significance, especially in the political realm. It reinforces that traditional Greek belief that's encapsulated in the saying, ruling will reveal the man.
The idea being that if a ruler engages in the hard work of ruling justly, if they perform just actions that flow from the state of justice, they are simultaneously exercising complete virtue.
Yes. If justice is identical to virtuous, then the ruler doesn't need some separate additional character state to be a fully virtuous person. The act of justice, which is the most complete and difficult form of moral action, demonstrates that the agent possesses the complete character state.
So the act of justice is the highest form of virtue, not because it's a separate superior state,
but because it is the exercise of the whole state in the most demanding context possible.
This also seems to streamline the whole process of character building, what you call the unified cultivation of character.
It does. Since the states are unified, ethical development is unified. If you, the listener, cultivate courage in a context that seems purely self-regarding, let's say facing a scary medical procedure fearlessly, you are strengthening the underlying unified state virtues.
And by strengthening that underlying unified state, you are, by necessity, strengthening your justices to, say, stand your ground in a battle or to face down a political opponent justly.
Correct. Aristotle eliminates the need for entirely separate moral training programs. Developing the capacity to act virtuously toward yourself inherently develops the capacity to act virtuously toward others, but, and this is a crucial stress, the capacity is not the same as the demonstration. The cultivation is unified, but the exercise of justice still requires that difficult step of applying it pros heteron.
Which brings us back to the power of the exercise distinction. We already established that Aristotle's discussion of general justice is brief because it shares all the features of virtue as a whole. But this brevity is also an elegant solution to a political problem.
It is. Since the definition of justice focuses on lawfulness and its pros heteron dimension, Aristotle successfully integrates his ethics with his politics. The scope of general justice aligns perfectly with the scope of legal and political obligation. He gives us this clean interface between the virtuous private life and the necessary public life.
So the ultimate synthesis, then, is that this entire philosophical puzzle is resolved by recognizing that general justice and virtue share the same unified character state, the same potentiality, but they are differentiated by the distinct ways this single state is put into action.
Justice is complete virtue, seen in its greatest context and its greatest complexity. Its exercise pros heteron. This is why that old proverb says, in justice, all virtue is collectively within. It's not because justice is a collection of parts, it's because the act of justice requires exercising the whole state of virtue.
And that distinction between the settled character we are and the restricted social function we perform, that's the key that unlocks the true coherence of Aristotelian ethics. So we took a set of claims that seem completely contradictory, that have confounded scholars for millennia, and we resolved them just by making one precise technical distinction between the hexis and the crisis. And this realization that the state of general justice is numerically identical to the state of complete virtue has enormous ethical weight. It fundamentally links our private character to our public responsibility.
It does.
Which leaves me with a final question. If the highest form of virtue, general justice, is defined by its exercise in relation to another, does that mean that truly living an excellent life requires engaging ethically with the political and social sphere? Can you really be a complete person by retreating to isolated self-improvement? If virtue is truly complete only when it's actualized as justice-y, what stands out to you as the most important sphere for ethical development in your own life?
The philosophical implication seems inescapable. For Aristotle, ethical life is intrinsically political. The pursuit of personal excellence is, in some sense, incomplete until that unified state of character is successfully exercised in the difficult, necessary domain of dealing with other people. If the very definition of your character relies on the potential for its exercise pros heteron, then the private life is inseparable from the public one.
Food for thought indeed, as you continue to reflect on the astonishing precision of Aristotle's definitions.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the coherence of Aristotelian justice.